And I know that I already had to make sure that we're all on the same page. You guys do have course request contracts that are due on Thursday of this week, I think. I'm not sure what dates due this week, but just in case you were not aware, you're actually signing up for two separate courses. It's one course, but you break it up by fall and spring semester. So make sure that you do sign up for both. In a conference with Mrs. Molina this morning, she was saying that a lot of juniors were signing up for like Enhanced Math 3A, and then they put their alternate as Enhanced Math 3B. Make sure that you're not doing alternates, that you're actually signing up for both courses. So you're going to see like technically two separate math courses listed, and that's pretty consistent with all your other classes as well. Like you'll have two science classes listed because all of them are over basically fall and spring semester. The only time you wouldn't sign up for both of them is if for some reason there's no A and B listed at the end. That basically is meaning that it's a solid block class that you would only take for one semester. But otherwise, if you see an A and B option, you would sign up for both of them. Also, another thing, I think on Friday of this week, I'll actually be getting an Excel of all the classes that you guys sign up for. If at any point between this Friday and like June, you don't meet all three of those requirements, then I will individually reach out to you and let you know like, hey, at this point, you don't have my recommendation because of whatever reason. And then from there, we'll see like how you can work on making sure that you do get my recommendation by the end of the semester. Or if you currently don't have an 85% or higher, like how are we going to work toward making that happen by June? So all of those conversations we'll have individually. And again, I don't think that applies to most of you, but I did want to let you know that you might get an email or a message from me about that. As for the questions that are coming into the chat, Evelyn, yes, there are two separate ID numbers that you would have to type in individually for both courses. And you would put them in separately, Ashley. And again, if you guys mess up on this, that's fine. When I get the list of all the classes, if I notice that you forgot to sign up for one or the other, I will definitely make sure that I add the other one onto yours. This is just so I have less work and I don't have to do it like 200 times. Because every single teacher is going to be getting a list and doing reverse verifications. All right, so at this point, I am going to start going over the homework questions with you. I'm going to put a whiteboard so that you guys could actually see the work that's being done. And if you have questions while I go over this, as always, just write it into the public chat. So starting with question number 5, it says to find all values of b such that x squared plus bx plus 10 equals 0 has no real roots. So just a reminder, no real roots, one real root, etc. It all comes from the quadratic formula. When this part of the quadratic formula, what's underneath the square root, which is called the discriminant, when the discriminant is exactly equal to 0, then that means that you will have just one real root. So when b squared minus 4ac is equal to 0, that's one real root. When you have the number underneath the radical being greater than 0, any positive number plus or minus another number is going to give you two different solutions. And when b squared minus 4ac is less than 0, when you have a negative under the radical, that means that you have no real roots. It's going to end up being a complex number because it's a negative under a square root. So for number 5, this b value, you want to find the numbers so that it has no real roots, meaning that b squared minus 4ac is going to be less than 0. So from this point, all you have to do is plug in numbers. You don't know the b value, but you know a is 1 and c is 10. So negative 4 times 1 times 10 is negative 40 is less than 0. And then you're solving for this quadratic. When is b squared less than 40? You can take the square root of both sides, and I remember this being slightly difficult for us when we learned this, so I do understand why this came up. The square root of b squared is the absolute value of b, which is less than 4 times 10 is equal to 40. So 2 rad 10 is the simplified version of that radical. Now from here, I end up getting two different inequalities. One of them would be b is less than 2 rad 10, but the other inequality would be negative b is less than 2 rad 10. So it's either that inequality or this one. For this inequality, I want to make sure it's in terms of b, so I'm going to divide the entire inequality by negative 1, so I get b is greater than negative 2 rad 10. So once you get to this point, I wish there was a way to erase on this screen, but there is not. So let me see actually if I can. Just using a white pen. Once I get rid of all of that, then going back to finish this, you could pretty much do a number line if you don't know if it's like and or in between. But here it would be negative 2 rad 10. This is 2 rad 10 against a number line. And b values that are less than 2 rad 10 would be an open circle. All the b values that are less than that. B values that are greater than negative 2 rad 10 would be all these values here. And what you would be doing is looking for the intersection, basically where's the overlap. So it would be in interval notation. We would take these two separate inequalities and rewrite it as parentheses negative 2 rad 10, comma 2 rad 10. Or you could write these two inequalities with the word and in between them. If we have no other questions there, then I am going to continue on to the next homework question that was asked. It was number 10. Okay. Negative 1/3 times the absolute value of x minus 4 plus 10 is greater than or equal to 15. Okay, what I would do is try to get the absolute value function by itself on one side of the inequality. So that means subtracting 10 from both sides. So negative 1/3 times the absolute value of x minus 4 is greater than or equal to 5. Then from here, to get rid of this negative 1/3, I'm going to multiply the entire inequality by negative 3. Dividing by a negative or multiplying by a negative is going to switch my inequality sign. And in addition to that, negative times negative is positive. I'm ending up with just the absolute value of x minus 4 is less than or equal to negative 3 times 5, which is negative 15. Once you get to this point, it's basically saying when is this absolute value going to be less than a negative number? So you always stop once you get the absolute value by itself on one side of the inequality and see, is it possible to continue solving it? Any x value that you input into this absolute value function is going to end up being a positive number. A positive number can never be less than a negative number. So since this point, it's impossible to plug in any x value that's a real number and end up getting less than a negative number, we would stop here and say that the answer is simply just no solution. There is no possible value of x that I could plug in here that's going to be less than a negative number. Again, if there are no questions, I'm just going to continue on. Oh, actually, I do see questions coming in. What if the number is 0? If we put no real solution, is that okay? Yes, it is okay to put no real solution. Again, I'm going to be individually going through every single answer for every single person's test to make sure that formatting issues are not the error or is not the error or the reason why you got that wrong. And if the number is 0, then you would still solve for the inequality, as long as it says equal to. If it says less than, then it would be different, but it's definitely possible to be equal to 0. Yeah. I think, again, the next one is number 12. Let's see. This one came up in every class, actually. Negative x squared plus 6x plus 10 is less than or equal to 20. So when you have a quadratic inequality, you solve it slightly different than how you would do an absolute value inequality. You would solve it as if you're solving a quadratic equation. So I'm first going to move everything over to one side. So negative x squared plus 6x minus 10 is less than or equal to 0. And when you're solving for a quadratic inequality, I'm first going to find the roots, meaning I'm going to ignore the fact that I have an inequality and simply just solve for this quadratic equation. So again, I'll go back to the inequality later, but for now, solving this quadratic equation means you can solve it by factoring, completing the square quadratic formula. When I checked your homework, majority of you always just chose quadratic formula, so I'll do the same as well. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a is positive 4 times negative 10 is negative 40 all over 2a. So then at this point, most of you stopped and you said that this is going to be no solution. And the reason why that's wrong is because, yes, technically you would stop at this point and there's no real root because you end up getting a complex number. However, that's not what the question is asking. I have to actually go back and solve for this question. Now that I know the roots, no real roots, all that means is that when I graph my quadratic like this, what I'm doing is first graphing this equation. So it has a y-intercept down at negative 10. My axis of symmetry is negative b over 2a, and it will never cross the x-axis because, like I found earlier, there are no real roots. But once did it cut off? Okay. Oh, sorry. Let me repeat what I just said then. Oh, I wonder why. So what I did was I first found the roots, found that there are no real roots, and then I graphed my quadratic. And again, no real roots just means that it will never cross the x-axis. So then from here, what I'm going to do is go back and actually solve or answer this question. When is my graph less than or equal to 0? Well, it's never going to be equal to 0, obviously. However, the entire quadratic is always going to be less than 0. So because it is the entire parabola, that's why my answer was all real numbers, or over the interval from negative infinity to infinity, or always. Hopefully that clarifies why, even though it had no real roots, it's still all real numbers. Again, I apologize for the mic issues. I actually applied for the, what's that called? The thing that Bardia sent me, Logitech. Anyway, and then they ended up saying that they'll send me one. So I guess I made the cutoff of like however many teachers they are giving it to. We'll see if I ever receive it. Yeah, thank you, Bardia, again for that. And Tej, the last part, all I said was that even though you end up getting no real roots is only solving this part of the question. What are the roots? But because this is an inequality, I have to go back and figure out when this quadratic is going to be less than or equal to 0, which always happens. And the very last question here, question number 14. Okay, so for 13 and 14, what I always highly recommend doing is a very simple sketch of your graph. So the reason why is because most of us, I think, are like visual learners. It helps us a little bit better when we're trying to come up with our answer. But in number 14, it says that there's some kind of rocket that's launched from a tower. The height represents y. So the y-axis is represented by the height in feet. And then it says is related to the time after launch, x in seconds. So we know that the x-axis represents the time in the unit of measure is seconds. And this is the quadratic equation that it's modeling. So it has a y-intercept up at 127. Negative b over 2a gives us some positive axis of symmetry, and it opens downward. So this is like a very, very basic sketch of what that graph looks like. Again, it does not have to be super accurate. And for the first question, find the time that the rocket hits the ground. Well, it's going to hit the ground at this point right here when the height is equal to 0. So for letter A, you would set 0 equal to negative 16x squared plus 140x plus 127. And when you solve for this quadratic, you are going to get two separate answers. One is going to be a negative answer and one is going to be a positive answer. However, because we know that the negative answer is going to be representing a negative time, I know that it's only going to be whatever positive value I get. Hopefully that makes sense. We'll move on to part B. So then in part B, it says, what is the rocket's maximum height? Well, the maximum height is going to happen right here, which is at the vertex of your parabola. That's the maximum height in terms of the variable y. But before I answer part B, it might actually be helpful first to find the answer to C, because it says, what is the time that it reaches the maximum height? So I know for part C, I'm finding the x variable. I'm trying to find what is this x value that will give me the time that it reaches its maximum height. Since we know it happens at the vertex, which is also on the axis of symmetry, for letter C, I'm just going to use the axis of symmetry formula, x equals negative b over 2a. So negative b over 2 times a is going to give me negative 140 over negative 32, which is equal to 4.375. And now that I found the answer to letter C, I can actually go backwards and find the answer to letter B by taking this x value and plugging it into my equation. So it would be negative 16 times 4.375 quantity squared plus 140, etc. I don't have enough space to write that, but hopefully you guys can figure the rest of that problem out. All right. If there are no other questions from the homework assignment, again, the majority of you asked those questions. We are going to get started with polls for today. So today you're not submitting anything for classwork credit. Your classwork credit is the fact that you're in here and you're responding to all the polls correctly. So if you need scratch paper, you can take that out. But I am going to put a couple polls up here for you. Wait until the majority of you respond to these questions. And again, you are getting credit for today's classwork. And then once I have this written down, x squared minus 6x plus 4, when is this greater than or equal to 0? So to solve this quadratic, again, just like we did previously in the homework assignment that we went over together, you would set it first equal to 0. So find the roots. When is x equal negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. That's 6 plus or minus rad 20 over 2. Rad 20 is equal to 5 times 4. So 6 plus or minus 2 rad 5 over 2 gives me two roots, 3 plus rad 5 as well as 3 minus rad 5. So when you go back and you actually graph this inequality, that means that 3 minus rad 5 would be right here. 3 plus rad 5 would be over here, a very simple sketch of an upward facing parabola. When is it greater than or equal to 0? It's equal to 0 at exactly this point and this point right here. That's when it equals. And it's greater than for this portion of the curve and this portion of the curve, which would match answer choice D. Hopefully that was helpful for everyone. Moving on to the next question. Okay, so a third of the class got this one incorrect. So the correct answer choice was letter E. We'll definitely go over this one together since 1 out of every 3 got this wrong. So what I would do first is negative 5 times the absolute value of negative x plus 7 is greater than or equal to negative 45. Like we did in the homework assignment, you always make sure that it's set equal, or you make sure that the function of the absolute values by itself. So you would divide everything by -5. My Microsoft Word keeps opening up and it's like glitching and opening up every like 2 seconds. So I'm going to have to walk this one through by audio only. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. The first thing you would do is divide both sides by -5. And when you divide by -5, the inequality symbol will switch. Okay, thankfully it's working. Nope, it's not. So the inequality symbol will switch, and then you'll end up getting -x plus 7 is less than or equal to +9. So yes, you can try this visually. However, just make sure that you aren't making algebraic mistakes in the process. You end up having two separate inequalities. One would be -x plus 7 is less than or equal to 9. The other would be +x minus 7 is less than or equal to 9. So for this one, you end up getting -x is less than or equal to 2, which means that x is greater than or equal to -2. And then for this inequality, you add 6 or 7 to both sides, and then you get x is less than or equal to 16. And that does not match any of the answer choices that are listed. So the only correct answer is letter E, none of the above. Okay, and then the very last question for you guys to answer. Thank you guys, great job. We are going to go over this together, but like it was previously mentioned, the very first step would definitely be to rewrite this into its vertex form. So if you got the vertex form incorrect, then the rest of your answer would be incorrect as well. So please make sure you check to see that you have f of x is equal to -1/2 times x minus 4 quantity squared plus 16. So from this point, if the very first thing we're doing is a vertical compression by a factor of, what is that? A factor of 4, then you can just visualize what a vertical compression would look like. 4, 16 as the vertex is a downward facing parabola. So this is what our parabola currently looks like. If we are vertically compressing it, we are pushing it inward, making it a wider parabola. So now my parabola will look something like this. Remember, sometimes it could be vertical compression by a factor of 4, and sometimes you'll see it as vertical compression by a factor of 1/4. I know it's quite confusing. However, when it's a vertical compression, you know that it's becoming more wide. So what we're going to do is, because we know the vertex is also changing, I'm taking the entire equation in vertex form, and I am multiplying this entire thing by 1/4. So then at this point, I have -1/8 times parentheses x minus 4 quantity squared plus 4. So my new vertex is at 4, 4. Then if I'm reflecting this parabola over the x-axis, then I know that, again, I have a new vertex, and this is a simple sketch of what it looks like. So for part 2, I am going to multiply my entire expression by a negative. So then I end up getting +1/8 times x minus 4 quantity squared minus 4. And the last one is the translation. I am translating it 6 units to the left. So for this one, I'm basically moving it over in this direction, and it's going to look something like this. I know that that affects the h value. So then I end up getting 1/8 times x minus -2. So x plus 2 quantity squared minus 4, which again matches most of your answers, starting with Bardia-Aaron and all the way down. And my equation would be f of x is equal to that expression. Okay, so great job today. Again, please check your private messages. You would have received one from me if you got 3 or 4 out of the 4 poll questions incorrect. And basically, I'm just going to ask that you do a little bit more practice for the Unit 3 material before your test. However, for tonight, there is no homework. All you are doing is really studying for your test.